With all these allegations flying around about the BBC against an as yet unnamed presenter and allegations of a very serious nature, many people have asked, well, how does the BBC cover a story against the BBC? Well, you're in luck, because the BBC has produced an article talking about how the BBC covers stories about the BBC, saying quite clearly that just like other stories, BBC News journalists will treat the BBC in the same way as any other organisation the news service reports on. And like as with any other organisation, the BBC News has to ask BBC management or BBC services for responses and contact the BBC press office for official statements. And occasionally BBC journalists approach senior managers for unplanned interviews known as doorsteps in the news business. Now, I, for one, found that very interesting. Now, there's a number of issues here that I'd like to talk about in this video, and one of the questions as to whether an offence has been committed, for which we have a very interesting video over on The Art of Law, which is the new name of the moment, which I kind of like, so I think we're going to stick with. The Art of Law, with myself, Alan, and Robert Shaw, which at the moment still rhymes. We're still thinking of something that doesn't rhyme that we can insist does. So do feel free to go and check that out as well, because that's a very interesting and informative video. I will link that in the description below. But the BBC article that I'm referencing, which I will also link in the description below, has a few updates that are very interesting today. It says on here, if you're just joining us, this is what's happened. A police force confirmed that it was contacted in April about the unnamed presenter by the parents of the young person at the centre of the allegations reported in The Sun. I'll come back to the report by The Sun in a moment, because that in and of itself is very interesting and also covered by the BBC report. It says, the force says that no criminality was identified at the time, but that further inquiries are now ongoing. Meanwhile, a second young person has made allegations to the BBC about the unnamed presenter, so it suggests it's the same person. The individual, who is in their early 20s, said the presenter put them under pressure to meet up. When the young person hinted online they might name the presenter, they were sent abusive, expletive-filled messages. Referencing a timeline, the BBC said that it set out the timeline detailing when the allegations were made, and in it, the corporation says that senior managers only put the claims to the presenter last Thursday, some 7 weeks after the initial complaint. In an interview with the BBC, Director General Tim Davie defended the BBC's response, insisting the right process had to be followed before the presenter was approached by a senior manager. He also said he had asked a senior BBC figure to look into whether the corporation's processes for raising red flags are fit for purpose in light of the recent revelations. Reading further, as in later in the day in the same story on the BBC website, which I'll link below, it provides further details of those allegations themselves, as published by The Sun. It said on Friday, The Sun published allegations that the BBC presenter paid a young person £35,000 for explicit photographs over 3 years. Money the person's mother said had been used to fund a drug habit. The Sun says the person's parents turned to them after the complaints to the BBC failed to lead to the presenter being spoken to or taken off air. The BBC says it twice tried unsuccessfully to make contact with the complainant. It was only when the Sun story broke that the Director General and Executive Directors were told about the case, so say the BBC. And on Sunday the presenter was suspended. Now, skipping a little bit further on, there's a suggestion in the article that the Sun was not necessarily on entirely solid ground, and instead is goading the BBC in trying to do the dirty work for them. I quote from the article from Alan Rusbridger. Now, looking at this story and the way that it's been put out by the Sun and the way that it's now covered by the BBC, I can't say that I entirely blame the Sun, because these are very serious allegations, which, if proven and if the presenter were named, could obviously lead to allegations of defamation and a lawsuit, and that is obviously something the Sun would like to avoid. But having had the story and wanting to do something with the story, clearly the Sun has brought it out into the open to effectively, in my view, in my reading from what's happening, force the BBC into an investigation to try to determine what's happened, and therefore to get to the heart of the matter, and ultimately the name will probably come out if there's any truth to it, I would have thought. But this article concludes by saying that the Prime Minister himself has said that these allegations in The Sun are shocking and concerning, and speaking to journalists travelling to the NATO summit, Rishi Sunak said that the government had been assured that the BBC is investigating and the process is being undertaken is rigorous and will be swift, and that given the concerning nature of the allegations, it's right that they're investigated swiftly and rigorously, and it's important we now let that carry on. So that's a subtle way of saying, let the report continue, let them find out exactly what happened with whoever has not been named, and determine whether there's any truth to the allegations. So that, at the very least, is a very interesting answer to what a lot of people have asked, which is, how is the BBC going to cover a story against essentially one of its own, when so many have come out to say it's not me? Notably, Jeremy Vine, Gary Lineker, and Ryland Clark. In fact, Sky News reported on a tweet that was liked by Jeremy Vine that said, "I find both Jeremy Vine and Ryland mildly irritating and I switched channels. However, there's no way either of them deserves to be a target of such speculation." Now, as you'll hear from our Alan Robertshaw on The Art of Law, there is a serious risk of anybody who is slinging accusations against any such presenter without any foundation, of having a lawsuit filed against them for defamation, which, as Al will tell you in that video that I'll link below, can cost you a pretty sum of many, many tens of thousands of pounds to defend, and many more tens of thousands of pounds if you lose. Piers Morgan, on the other hand, tweeted a single word: ridiculous, in response to a tweet about the BBC investigation, which said, "BBC host asks BBC reporter standing outside the BBC about allegations against unnamed BBC star. BBC reporter says they haven't been able to confirm whether the BBC presenter had been suspended by the BBC." It sounds all, and I suppose you can understand from that where Piers is coming from. That tweet itself sounds ridiculous. An organisation carrying out an investigation into itself about allegations against itself, it's all a bit bizarre. But that's where we are. That's how it's been covered. That's what people have said. And I suppose it's only a matter of time until when, or indeed if, we find out who the unnamed presenter is and what really happened, if anything. Let me know what you think in the comments, but my guidance to you is, don't let me know who you think it is unless you want to be sued, and for that I'll leave you in the capable hands of Alan Robertshaw to tell you what the consequences of that might be. Go and watch that, make sure you subscribe, I'll see you next time.